What up, what up, what up? Welcome into another edition of Green with Envy. As always, this is your boy Will Weir checking in. How you doing? How you living? Joining me today, we have my podcasting cousin from across the pond, the leader of the Taylor gang, the one and only Adam Taylor. Adam, how are you doing today, my friend?
I'm good, man. I'm good. I scrambled to get that music ready then. I scrambled so hard.
I saw the panic in your eye and I tried to elongate my sentences as much as I could because this has become our new running gimmick when we intro you to the show. I saw you scrambling to get it done. So this is us working in tandem right now where we don't even need to communicate, Adam. We just look at each other's eyes and we know to make a cut. We know when to screen. We know when to roll. We know when to elongate our words so we can get our gimmicks done. How you doing today though, man?
I'm good, man. I'm good. I'd be better if my dog wasn't snoring everywhere. I'm trying to nudge him to wake him back up. Other than that, I'm living, man. It's been sunny out here for the last few days. I'm living that Austin, Texas, that Florida life where you wake up, it's sunny. You look
That's
out the
right.
window in the evening, it's sunny. I haven't
There
seen a
you
cloud
go.
in about a week.
Well, we like a cheerful Adam Taylor here on the show for us today. But speaking of Florida, that leads us directly into our special guest that we have joining us today from Spot Track and now officially, formally of Celtics blog. It's our guy, the one and only Keith Smith. How you doing, Keith?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me.
How does it feel now that you've officially made the transition from off of Celtics blog? I don't know if we need to have an official retirement party for you. Do we hang your writings in the rafters with Kevin O'Connor and Jared Weiss? Like I feel like there's some type of ceremony that needs to go along with it. But how does it feel now, about a week or so since your final article on Celtics blog?
Yeah, it hit me when the Sam Cassell news came out, and normally something like that would come out, and I'd pop into the Celtics blog Slack and be like, "Hey, this is out there. Can anybody grab it?" And then if someone didn't reply within the next 2-3 minutes, I'd be like, "All right, I'll take it and I'll put together the newser on it." And then it hit me, and I literally just muscle memory was like, all right, I got to go get to sit down at my computer and open up the Celtics blog Slack. And then I was like, no, actually, I don't need to do that. That can be, someone else can do that now. And so that was the first time it really like full on hit me. And then the next time, right, it'll be over the summer when stuff is happening and moves are being made and all those kind of things. But it's just, I'll put it to rest here because a lot of people seem to think something went sideways or there's some like untoward story or something like that. It's nothing like that. It wasn't anything like that. It was just I had an opportunity to do more with Spot Track that I would not have been able to do while still doing the Celtics blog work, and it was just time. That's really all there is to it. Adam knows I would. If I thought it was not a great place to write and a good group of guys to work with, I would say so. I would have no problem with coming on here, but it's the exact opposite. Anybody who ever has a chance to cover this team or do anything, I would jump over there and work for Jeff and Bill, who run Celtics blog in a heartbeat. They're great guys, and it's a great group of people to work with and write with and cover the team with.
Jared Weiss put it the best to me about 18 months ago about Bill. He was like, he's my favorite Bill, he's my favorite Cy. I've coined him Bill Side, the Celtics guy. I don't know if I've ever coined him that to his face, but that's, and then Jeff is just like ridiculously amazing. He's like open door policy. What does make me sad though is I'm looking at the primer right now, and we've got Brad Stevens looking up towards the rafters, very sad. And what we should have done was superimpose like you just above him, looking back down. So it could have been more of a fitting goodbye.
Yeah, somehow I don't think Brad Stevens looks at me with those kind of eyes.
I mean, he will do when Mike Zarin leaves. He'll be like, Keith, we need Keith.
I will say one time, this is way back in the day, they played here in Orlando, and I asked him, he had kind of, the game was getting away from him in the second half, and he unleashed Marcus Smart and Terry Rozier and this two-man full court press. And I was like, was that kind of like unleashing the hounds? And then his response was, he goes, that is a great question. And then he went, and all the guys were like, you got the great question from Brad. Like you can retire off that. Like he doesn't give those out very often. And so I was on cloud nine for a little bit, and then the next time they were here, I asked him about why he this is going really nerdy into basketball stuff, but NBA teams, the visiting team picks which basket they want to shoot at in the each half. Well, they pick it for the first half and then they switch sides, obviously, at halftime. And they always played offense in front of Brad in the second half, which is opposite. Most teams play defense in front of their coach in the second half. And I asked him about that. And I said, is there a reason why you do that? And his response was, great question. Yes. That was it. That was all he said. He wasn't giving it up. He was not giving up his reason for it. So, yeah, he was at that time, he was one of 6 active coaches who did that. And he was the only one who wasn't from Pop's tree. There was a Greg Popovich and all his guys that had worked for him did it, and Brad, and that was it.
Popovich, Belichick, especially with where Belichick does that with, trying to get the ball back in the second half, have those back-to-back possessions. That feels like they would be aligned. And to be honest, that little nugget of information, I did not know that the opposing team got to choose which basket to start. I was just kind of assumed it was predetermined.
Yeah,
and within that, Keith, we can add to your resume. Got 2 good questions asked from, or 2 great questions from Brad Stevens, but. Something I want to ask you here, because I got to see, during our time at Celtics Blog, when obviously the podcast was there as well, we were all kind of interacting on the internal Slack, which, if you're lucky enough to be a part of, I think my favorite part about it is we're all kind of fans first, and we do have obviously an analysis side that comes out that's a little bit more even, but fan is short for fanatic, right? So we all, of course, especially in the moment, we have the same visceral reactions, and we try to then corral them a bit and put them into a podcast or put them into written words. But a week after, or a week plus after this, now that the NBA Finals, as we're recording, is 2 games in, tied at 1 game apiece, where are you at emotionally on this just roller coaster, which sometimes is an overused word, but was definitely, very appropriate for the Celtics season, specifically the postseason. Where are you at emotionally before we start getting into the finances and the future implications of this offseason? Where are you at emotionally with this past Celtics season, given a little bit of time to reflect?
Yeah, I went through a whole run of stuff. There was a little bit of anger that it ended the way it ended. There was a little bit of relief. Adam knows this probably better than most. I was pretty worn out by the end of the season. I had done all of the takeaways myself after every single game without a pinch hitter. Even one time I had done a lot of other work, and I do that in addition to the other jobs I have covering the league too. So there was a sense of relief of it's over with that, and then I had kind of wrote that final takeaways piece, and then started. Once that published, I kind of took the rest of that day. And then I wrote the off-season primer, which was my last piece for the site. And by the time I wrote the off-season primer, I had moved on. It is, season's over. It's about next year. And we move on. I generally tend to be pretty good at compartmentalizing those things where it's it's over and we move on to what's next. And that's where we go. And in this case, there was a little bit more pressure to just I got to get this article out and you'll get it posted because it's I'm down to it with time here with the site. But then game 1 of the finals came around. It was that day of that everybody was kind of doing all the media stuff, and I was like, oh man, it kind of hit me of a year ago. This was us, right? We were covering all this and looking forward to it. So it was a little bit bummed out when that creeped in, but for the most part, I've moved on to the off season and I'm ready to go. I turn the page very, very quickly with this stuff because I write it a lot, and I write it because I believe it is the NBA calendar moves very quickly and it doesn't pause for anybody. There's no it just keeps going. There's no time for sulking about things and crying about what happened. You just got to move on to whatever's next.
Next season, for anybody that doesn't know, you watch multiple games per day, and I know you've said this on multiple podcasts before, you let Twitter kind of guide you to what games at what point, but you've always made sure to get that first watch and that rewatch of the Celtics in, right? And that's partly because that's work at that point. You have to get the first watch in, then you can gather some thoughts, go into the rewatch, consolidate what you saw, maybe pick up on some extra things that kind of went under the radar. Do you think, how hard is that going to be to move away from doing that for the Celtics, considering now that you're doing the entire NBA?
It's going to feel really weird to not watch Celtics games twice and to not watch them with the level of detail. When the Celtics play for the last 7 years, I watch only the Celtics game. Maybe if it's a blowout, I might flip over. I might, multi-screen it and leave them as one of the screens. But I pretty much stay tapped in because I know I'm going to write the takeaways the next day, and I know I'm going to watch it again the next day. Now, second day rewatches, Adam and I have talked about this quite often, even on podcasts. If it's a 30-point blowout, either way, I'm not spending a lot of time rewatching, the fourth quarter or a second time, right? There's only so many hours in the day, and I want to allocate those hours elsewhere. But for the most part, any game that's relatively close, I'm going to watch the whole thing all the way through. The nice thing is you can rewatch an NBA game in under an hour if you're watching the possession only view, because it cuts out all the other stuff, right? It's really just kind of locks you into that. And that's always been a good way to kind of consume that a second time. Or like I take detailed notes, like generally from every game. I'll have a notes document that I have up. I use a Word document, but I have I bullet point them and I number them, and then I have it looks like the work of a madman, but like I have a whole system. So I know when the play happened and the time and what it was that I'm trying to pull out of that play and all this stuff. But I'll generally have somewhere between 100 and 120 of those notes every game at the end of it, just so that way I can go back and see things, right? And sometimes they're general themes. Sometimes it might be like really bad rebounding Q2. Really great, offensive approach in the first half or whatever it is. And then other times it's very specific plays, but I'll lock in, in those the really good games, are really important games, especially the playoffs. It'll be, over 100 notes deep, and that's on a game that might only have, 100 offensive possessions in it. Like I will, basically have a note on all of it. And then you can't write an article that long. No one will read it. So then it becomes, all right, let's parse these down. Let's go. Let's kind of run with a theme here. The whole idea of the takeaways was let's tell the story for anybody who missed the game and didn't have a chance to watch it with some visual clips. And then I loved nothing more than over the years of, hey, you like one of my favorite things was this was like, maybe it was about 3 years into Jaylen Brown's career. There was a play where he caught a ball at half court and he actually caught it, took a dribble and like slowed himself up. And the defender was right there. Because he slowed himself up, he was able to then turn the jets on and go by the guy, where in his first 2-3 years, he would have caught it and just put his head down, bowled the guy over, would have been an offensive foul and a turnover. And like, that was one of my favorite clips to pull that I've ever pulled, because nothing ended up. He went by the guy and then he passed it, and then the shot got missed. But I was like, this is when you watch the game with that level of detail. Those are the things you pick up on, right? Those little pieces of like, he finally did this, right? Or like, oh, they're now running this set where it's, you get it, you eventually, it's like, it's the same set. Like, I've seen this a million times, and it gets to the point where it's like, all right, if they're lining, Tatum up in the backcourt, they're either going to hit him on the run, or they're going to play this way, or they're going to lob it in over the top to a big, and all the different things. And that's the stuff that'll hit me when I get into that first round of the takeaways for a first game, or not into the first round of the takeaways, I guess. It'll hit me like, well, I'm just going to sit down and watch and not make a million notes. Like that'll hit me, and that'll probably be a little bit emotional, a little bit rough.
Well, I know
just to jump in.
Oh, go ahead, Adam.
Sorry, just to jump in, I've just counted my notes from an average game, and I sit at around 50. So obviously, I need to up the note.
No, you don't need to up them. It's madness, man. There's a lot of stuff in there too, like a note, maybe lineup combos. For me, like, yeah. So yeah, you do it by hand. I just do it in a Word document. If I tried to write it, I wouldn't be able to read it back. My handwriting is atrocious, and I'd be like, I don't even know what this means. And I'm going to be fully honest. There's a couple times I've made notes, and I'm like, I don't remember what that meant. And then if I'm watching the possession only, I'm like, it didn't stand out. So then it's usually, it must not have been that important. Like, let's get away from
Keith.
that.
It's like, I don't know if you're a Seinfeld fan, but there's the Seinfeld episode where he wakes up in the middle of the night, scribbles down a joke that he finds hilarious. Yeah. And then he goes around everybody. Do you know what this says?
Yep.
And everybody has a different interpretation.
Yeah, I remember that
of what it is. I think that clip actually came up this year because one of them was a psychic had told him, I think it was like Cleveland 105, Detroit 102. And it actually was a score this year that actually matched up with that. But, I know that obviously being, in addition to the notes that you take for individual games, I know that you have spreadsheet upon spreadsheet upon note of everything transaction based for your work with Spot Track. So, you know, with that, I want to transition a little bit here into the offseason. Because like you said, at a certain point, it's unfortunate the way the Celtics season ended, but we're moving on here and we have to kind of keep looking forward. So the first part of that is starting July 1st, there is a new collective bargaining agreement that goes into place. And, you know, we don't have to go too deep into this, but I just want to try to hit on the key points that Celtics fans really need to know, because I know we're going to dig into what it means for Jaylen Brown, what it means for Grant Williams, and what this roster complexion, you know, what are the ways to go about forming this roster over the next 1 to 3 years, because that's really where this CBA is going to come into play. So if you could just kind of lay out the top 2 to 3 things that are really going to be super important for Celtics fans to know as the offseason gets going here.
Yeah, this new CBA has been painted as it is designed to break up the most expensive teams in the league. And that is true with caveats. Had they pushed for a hard cap, we would be sitting here today talking about a lockout that's coming, you know, when the finals ends. Like the draft would be our last big thing, and then they'd go right into a lockout, and that'd be it. Because the NBPA was never going to give in on a hard cap. Where they settled was this kind of pseudo hard cap of this second tax apron. So what happens in today's NBA? Set the salary cap at, and I'll just use next year's projections just because it's easiest. So the cap is projected at 134 million. The tax line is projected at 169 million. I'm sorry, 162 million. The tax apron, which has existed for years, the now they're calling it the tax apron or first tax apron, or colloquially known as the hard cap line, because that's where if you were subject to, you'd get hard capped. That's about 7 million over the tax line, 169 million. Now they've introduced this new thing called the second tax apron. I call it the super tax because I think it's a lot more fun than second tax apron. But super tax line is 10.5 million over the tax line. So that bumps you to 17.5 million over that full luxury tax line. So we're up at about 179.5 million. Teams that are above that get a whole layer of restrictions and penalties that will be put upon them to build out their roster. You can always re-sign your own players. You can always sign your draft picks. You can always sign players to minimum contracts, with one caveat that I'll hit in a second here. But that's basically, if you're that expensive, that's what you're limited to. Because what's going to happen is, so starting this summer, starting this July 1st, teams that are above that line, they will not have the taxpayer mid-level exception. So that they won't even have it. Now they've reduced that exception in value. It's down to about $5 million. So it should have been about 7.5-ish million. Mm-hmm. They've reduced that number down. And if you're above that line, you don't even get it. So so the Warriors signing Dante DiVincenzo could not happen this summer. They'll be limited to what they can do. Almost all of the other penalties kick in with the start of the 2024 offseason. 2024 off season. So a year from now. Mm-hmm. So what happens on those ones when that comes up, some of the restrictions that'll come in are, I mentioned you can always sign players to a minimum contract, except if they were a buyout player that made more than the non-taxpayer MLE. So essentially the Kevin Love type of buyout.
Russell Westbrook as well.
Russell Westbrook, yep. Exactly. That's a great example. You would not be able to sign those kind of guys if you're above that number. If a guy's just a minimum dude who got waived, you can go sign him because he's just a minimum guy. You're re-signing him to a minimum. It's basically, let's stop the rich from getting richer. Trades become far, far more difficult to pull off. There's 2 big restrictions on trades. One is you can trade only dollar for dollar. So if you send out 20 million, you can bring back 20 million. What's in today's CBA, if you send out 20 million, you can generally bring back about 100, or you can bring back, a bump above that. So be about 25 million, on top of that. Now in the new CBA, 20 million goes out, 20 million or less can come back in. The other thing that comes into play with that is you can no longer aggregate salaries together. So you cannot take two $10 million players, put them together and go trade for a $25 million player. You would not be allowed to do that in the new CBA. Again, not this summer, but next summer. This summer, think of it as it's kind of sort of the bridge year, the get your stuff in order kind of year, if that's where you want to go. With that. So that's another limitation. You're limited on trading draft picks. Your draft pick, if you're a super tax team, if it's your own pick, it'll fall to the end of the first round. So if you should add the 25th pick, it's going to fall to the 30th pick. Is where that'll go. You're going to be bumped back as a penalty for being above the super tax line. You also can't trade a pick that's 7 years out. That pick becomes frozen. And then you have to be out of the super tax for a pre-described window of, I believe it's 4 years. Then that'll free back up to be able to be traded. So the Kevin Durant trade this season would not have been allowed to happen because the Suns would have been up and over the super tax line. They wouldn't have been able to do it. So these are the kind of things that are coming. So basically it's when I say you're down to re-signing your own guys, signing your draft picks and signing minimum contracts, that's kind of because that's where you're at. Yes, you can still do trades and there's going to be unintended consequences of the way I think some teams are going to work around the trade rules. I'm going to be quite honest with you, but for the most part, you're going to be pretty limited in how you can build out a roster if you're that expensive of a team.
Which I think brings, oh, sorry, Will, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Adam.
I was going to say, I think that kind of brings us to the elephant in the room, right? With the Jaylen Brown Super Max. So the argument I've been having across social media is it's not just about when you Supermax Jaylen, it's about when you have to Supermax Tatum, right? And Will, we've spoke at this on a few shows now, where now you're committing 70% of your entire cap space to two guys, and you still need to fill out another 14 roster spots. Brad Stevens, in his recent press conference, was like, yeah, I believe in this core. We have every faith in this core. Good. Okay, you've paid the lip service you need to pay. But realistically, where do they stand in terms of should they Supermax? Like, what's the most logical path forward for them? Not what we think they'd do, but what logically speaking will be the best path forward.
Yeah, there's two approaches you can take to that, right? I think approach one is you just let tomorrow's problem be tomorrow's problem, and I think that's the one they're going to take, which is Supermax Jaylen, pay him whatever that works out to be, and then move forward. One thing to be very clear on, they would both starting salaries would be 35% of the cap, but it'd be Jaylen 1 year, then Tatum kicks in the year behind him. And in that case, what would happen with each of those guys is it would be they can get 8% raises on top of that. The cap is projected to grow by 10% each year. So it'll never be quite 70% of the cap. It'll always be slightly less. Not enough that it's going to make a huge difference. They're still going to be wildly expensive as a team goes if you do that and put those two guys on the max. I mean, the reality is those two guys alone will make well in advance of $100 million, just the two of them. And then that's two guys out of 15. Right. So you still got to fill out 13 more spots, with your precious little to do it with. Even if you could clear everything else, you're down like 20 million-ish in cap space to, fill out the rest of your roster with for 13 players. So not that much. But the other piece is with that too, is that's of the cap. When the real lines you care about start to be the tax and the tax apron and the super tax line. And at that point, they'd be, let's call it roughly 50 to 60% of the cap versus the 70% of the cap. So I just want to make sure, because it sounds alarming, right? When we say they'll be making 70%, but it's really, it is, but it kind of isn't too on that, but
especially when you're in championship contention, right?
Correct.
Because most of the teams that are in championship contention are going to live right at, or ideally below that, that super tax apron that you're talking about, or just below it. You're gonna be right in there. And so, a lot of the offseason conversation so far when looking at this Jaylen Brown Super Max, and I agree, I think the most likely route is Super Max him, and it kind of becomes a problem for, because there'll be that year-long trade restriction, I believe, if he signs that Super Max. This will be a next season, or really once Tatum's next extension kicks in, that's when it starts to get a little bit tight, and it will be that, whatever the problem is at that time. But you'll also have some of the current roster that will be coming off the books at that time, and salaries around the league. And this is kind of where I want to go with this next question. It feels like that middle class of player is going to have a re-examining. You talked about that taxpayer mid-level, which Danilo Gallinari got last year, just below 7 million-ish. You said is now going to be about 5. You look at the fact that the Celtics have 3 guards that are all making $18 to $22 million. My guess, and it's just a guess, obviously, at this point, but that's probably not going to be the world that we're living in, that you're not going to be able to have that, nor are they probably going to be able to garner that on the open market just based off the finances. So when I look at this new CBA, one thing that kind of jumps out to me is, you talked about, of course, you can always re-sign your own players, but only up to a certain level before you get hit so hard with penalties that even that doesn't make sense.
Sorry to interrupt you, Will, but
No,
on that too, one thing we didn't talk about is, and this should be less of a fan concern, but it is still a real concern, is there are stricter financial penalties only, right? In today's world, there are limitations to being super expensive under the current CBA. But for the most part, it's, hey, if your ownership is willing to pay, like Steve Ballmer, like the Lakers, and with the Warriors, then you're golden, right? You're fine. They'll just pay whatever the penalties are and move on. Well, instead of being like 3 and 4 times per dollar for being a repeater that's in the super tax, it's going to be more like 6 and 7 times per dollar. So it starts to get absolutely absurd, the amount of just tax penalties you're paying on top. And that's where, right. And I'm one of the people who tweets these out all the time. In today's world, it's like, okay, the Warriors are signing, player X to a, minimum contract worth, $1.9 million. That'll actually come with a cost of, $17 million because of, the penalties and associated kit that goes on top of that and everything. So that's one of the things where, that's going to get even more restrictive, but that's an ownership thing, right? That's where, all right. But that said, I've been very critical of ownership groups where and I've said it in the past, like, hey, these are all toys for you, right? And if you don't want to play and invest money into your toy, then sell the team, right? Sell the team and move with somebody who will. There's still limits, right? There's still like, that's further than, is reasonable to think they can go. I want to go back to one other thing, though, if I can, very quickly, because Adam asked, and I only answered half of his question. Half of it is re-sign Jaylen Brown, let tomorrow be tomorrow's problem, move on. The other option is to say, no, we're not doing it, right? Like we will give you a very large contract, but it's going to be 30% of the cap, which he's already qualified for, or we'll go to, 32% with incentives that could push you up a little bit higher or whatever it is, but we're not going to the full max amount. I tend to think if we start quibbling over 5%, that starts getting a little silly, where we're going with this, especially for guys like Jaylen. And I think you run the risk of insulting him and pissing him off. The other option is you offer him the super max. If he says no, you have to trade him. There can be no other decision made. And I know people are like, you keep saying that, but that's why would you, just let it play out. Because then you're going to lose him a year from now for nothing. Because one player, since these super max have been a thing, has turned it down. It insisted on, I'm not signing it because I don't want to be here. That was Kawhi Leonard, and the Spurs ended up trading him away. You have to do it because you can't let him walk for nothing. And if you don't think there'll be teams that are going to be, all right, let's start lining up for a whole year. We're going to set everything in motion so we have enough to offer Jaylen Brown the absolute max we can when he's a free agent in the summer of 2024. You're fooling yourself. So if the Celtics offer it, and I've been saying this for literally months now, if they offer and he says no, sound the alarm bells and flashing red lights and whatever else you need to, because it's time to trade him and move on. And I'm not going to take that fully off the table. I don't think it'll happen, because I think at the end of the day he's going to be like, yeah, I can do it 290 to 300 million. Because the reality of the NBA is, he's not happy a year or two in, he asks for a trade then, right? Because that's just the way it goes. We've all kind of made our peace with it. That's how this is going to go. These guys grab the money when it's there and go. But so I think what happens is full super max for Jaylen, and we, again, deal with those problems as they come down the line, or part of how we deal with it is in other ways, just not by removing Jaylen Brown from the picture. We start moving on from other guys to rebalance a little bit that way.
Personally, Keith, would you, if you were the Celtics organization, regardless of what Jaylen Brown's going to say, yes or no, would you offer the full super max?
Yeah, I've gone back and forth on this a million times, and I was super disappointed in his game 7 performance because this was like his chance to be the guy. And once emotions got past, it's all right. It was one bad game, right? He had one bad game. Yeah, it was a bad game at the absolute worst possible time, but it's one game. I'm not gonna change my whole thought process on this player. So I think he remains very tradable on the Supermax. So I'd give it to him, keep it moving, keep things going forward. With this team, I think it's easy to get caught up and get angry about they fell short of the finals, but the reality is last year they were in the finals. This year they were in a game 7. To go to the finals, like they're in the mix every year. I don't want to move too far away from things because I think when you start chasing upgrades, the upgrades are never going to be quite as good, and you're not going to get somebody as good as Jaylen Brown in a trade. It's just not going to happen. And in the NBA, we all know 4 quarters don't equal $1, right? And if you view Jaylen Brown as $1 player, 4 quarters are not going to be the same thing if you trade them for that. Other guys on the roster, yeah, maybe you could break them into two, reasonable players and those kind of things. But this is an all NBA, all star level guy. You're not getting equal value in a trade. It's just not going to happen.
Talking of breaking guys up into other pieces, maybe losing them, letting them go, saying Avida saying, we have to talk about Grant Williams. Now, I've been very vocal about Grant for months. You've both listened to me whine and whinge about his lack of playing time under Joe. He is going to be restricted. The Celtics can match whatever offer he has. Do you think he comes back? What's the logical outcome there with the future CBA kind of in mind? Obviously, they're not going to want to pay the money he was looking for at the start. It's a good thing they didn't agree to that now. Otherwise, we'd be talking about trading Grant rather than trying to keep him. So what do you see kind of the line in the sand being, and how logical is it that he comes back?
Yeah, I think we have pretty credible reporting that he turned down a deal that was worth about $12 million a season. Still think that was the right move for him. That's the mid-level amount now, right? And I think he's probably worth slightly more than the mid-level. So I think what happens with the Celtics is I think they probably at this point with Grant and his agent, they probably know, hey, this is what we'll do. If you can get this topped in an offer sheet, either come back and talk to us first and we'll see if do we want to mess around, or sign the offer sheet and then we'll make a decision off of that. And then what they may do is say, hey, rather than do an offer sheet, I'm just pulling them out because they're a cap space team, but rather than signing an offer sheet with the Indiana Pacers, let us talk with the Pacers and see, can we work out some kind of trade instead, where you still go there via sign and trade, and and then we get something back, right? And the Pacers they're a team that could definitely use a forward for sure, and they're a team the Celtics have obviously worked trades with in the past. But whether it's the Pacers or the Spurs or the Thunder or the Pistons or any number of teams, it's only one of the cap space teams that can make Boston blink. Because anybody else, it has to be through a sign and trade to give them more than the mid-level. And the mid-level amount of just over $12 million, Celtics, I think, would just match that. Be like, we're matching it. We're going to keep them here for that amount. I think anything in the 15, 16 million range, they probably match or just sign them to that themselves and move forward with that. I think anything that gets much above that, that's where you have to have a different kind of conversation of, can we turn this into some kind of mutually beneficial trade where he still gets everything he would have got, or sign the offer sheet and we'll see where it goes from there. But that's where it gets a little tricky because so I talked about, right? You can't add salaries together, right? So let's say we're 2 years into that deal and their super tax team because they kept Jaylen and all that stuff. Well, you can't take Grant at $15 million and Derek White at $19 million and go trade them for a $30 million player. It won't be allowed. So that's where Grant at even 18 to 20 million could be. Yeah, we think he's a $15 million player, but that extra $5 million in a trade, that has value too, right? Because we can't add 5 million to him anywhere. That's one of the kind of unintended consequences things I think is going to happen as part of this CBA. We're going to see some guys get overpaid just as the sense of, we're going to overpay you so we have you as basically a walking trade exception. Mm-hmm. We've got that. Mr. Numbers, Mr. Cap here. I don't like thinking of players in that sense. I feel a lot less bad about it when it's like they got $5 extra million out of it, then my feelings on the whole thing are very, very different. But I think there's a chance that could be the way we see some of these types of contracts go down for some of these guys where it's, yeah, we gave them a little bit more money because the whole idea is they're positive value to this number, but then on this number, if we throw a draft pick in to a deal, we can now get into a spot where it turns into, all right, we're moving on with a pretty solid trade package here because now we can match salary we wouldn't have been able to match otherwise.
Yeah, I think how teams move about these next, specifically this offseason and next offseason, with trying to get their books in line with the new CBA is going to be a little bit fascinating because, like you said, it feels, and this is something I wanted to ask you about, it feels to a degree a little bit restrictive for teams that are willing to spend. Because, like you said before, hey, you want to spend, it's just on the owners. And I've always been listen, like you look at the Celtics ownership, just as an example, they bought this team back in the early 2000s for, $300 million. It's now worth $4 billion. I'm not really in the position of caring about, them being, upset about being in the tax. If they have a championship team, big deal. They're going to be just fine. They're printing money left and right. But now, because of, being able to trade certain assets, add on players in different ways, there is a more roster building part of this. And I'm just curious for your personal opinion, do you think this CBA is going to be, a little bit harmful to those teams that were willing to spend, that were willing to say, hey, we really want to win. And now you have to make, I think to the Jaylen Brown point, Celtics are probably going to at least offer the Super Max, but it's at least a conversation of, man, are our books going to be so crazy in 2 years that even though this guy's a top 20 to 25 player, this might not make sense because you don't. The worst thing you can do to me in this new CBA is end up in a place like, say, the Washington Wizards, where you have a Max and Brad Beal. Maybe Porzingis is making, $30 million or so. And then maybe you give Kuzma some type of deal. And now all of a sudden you got those three and you can't even make the play in. And they're all good players in their own right. Porzingis was healthy this past year, had a really good season, but that ain't winning you nothing. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so now it becomes really restrictive about, what you can do. And even for teams that are, you mentioned all the teams with salary cap space going into this offseason. I look at a team like Oklahoma City. They've got Shea, who just made first team All NBA. Josh Giddey's pretty awesome. Chet Holmgren's awesome. Jalen Williams is going to be awesome. They're going to have a bunch of guys that they all can't pay at a certain point, even with all their draft picks. So at a certain point, it's going to hurt them, even with their own guys, if these guys all make 20, 30, $40 million. So, do you think the CBA leaned a little bit too aggressively into trying to break up these super teams? And now it's actually going to even hurt some teams with homegrown talent that they're trying to retain because of all the issues that come along with that super apron.
Yeah, absolutely. There's definitely going to be teams that are going to break up. Windows are going to be shorter in the NBA. It is going to be very, very difficult to have a Warriors-like run that is essentially stretched for a decade. By the time Curry, Thompson, and Green all age out of there, we'll have seen a decade-long run of, and I'll just call it excellence, even if there's been a couple years in there that weren't so great. I mean, most of the years were them competing for or winning titles. It's going to be very, very hard to have that kind of run because, one, you have to have an ownership group that can afford it with all the additional penalties. You're going to have to nail your draft picks that are going to be, in the late 20s, because presumably you should only do it if you're that good, right? If you're, hitting the, amounts of we're a second round team every year, you should not be, bumping your head against super tax every single year if you can't ever get past that point. But if you're in contention every year, yeah, which then means you're picking in the late 20s, which means you're going to have to nail those picks every single year because that's just, that's your best chance at replenishing your depth on your roster with that around those guys. So, and their challenges are going to be, now realistically, you lose a all NBA superstar player to injury, you're probably hurting anyway pretty bad, but you're really going to have no chance of recovering from it, right? Because you're just not going to have the depth to do that. So there's that. I still think, a team like the Clippers, right, they're the opposite of the Warriors. I don't know how much of this was really designed to break up the Warriors as it was to break up teams like the Clippers and the Nets, what the Nets were at the time that these decisions were being made. Teams that weren't homegrown, but were getting wildly expensive because they had added, then it was add. And how they kept adding was we kept turning $20 million of salary into 25 and then re-signing that player for 30. And then pretty soon, we've got, three max guys and a whole bunch of other dudes that make 20. And, we're $30 million over the luxury tax and off we go. I think those are the teams where it's like, that's scary, right? Because Steve Ballmer he could outspend the entire league put together almost. That's just literally how rich he is. Now it's like, you can still do it if you want, but you got to be able to build an actual functional roster, and that's going to have limits when you get there. And I think what's going to happen is, to your point, Will, used to be the conversation on like the Jaylen Brown situation was, Brad Stevens goes to Wyc Grousbeck, hey, can we pay the tax to keep Jaylen Brown? And Wyc says, yeah, okay, we'll do it. We'll pay the tax. Now Wyc's question needs to be, I will pay the tax, but can you build a roster that can compete? If I do, with all these additional restrictions that are coming in on top. And that's where it gets a little more, sideways. To the point you asked earlier is what they've tried to do in this is because on the other end of the spectrum, you can no longer go into the regular season like the Spurs and Pacers did this year, sitting $30 million under the cap. You're not going to be able to do that because what happens is they're going to put a cap hold on your book that basically wipes that out. So you're no longer sitting as a true under the cap team. And if you finish under the floor in terms of actual salary, you're not getting the luxury tax money from the teams that paid into the tax. It's not going to go to you. So basically what they're doing is saying everybody needs to, instead of having teams way down here, when we get on camera, way down here, and teams way up here, in salary, we want everybody here. Right, there's still going to be teams here, and there's going to be teams here, but we're a lot closer. Right, they're a lot closer, and that's why they made the non-taxpayer mid-level. They bumped it up to $12 million. The room exception, which was like a nice little bonus on top of having cap space, it's now $7.6 million. So you'll have another piece if you go under the cap and then use all your cap space. You can then use that to add some guys. They're doing things to try to force those teams at the bottom to spend. What they're trying to do is push it so everybody's tight, right? You're always going to have your team that's going to emerge. They're around for 3, 4, 5 year window, but then it's going to be really hard to keep them together. It'll rebalance. It'll re-go a different way. They'll cycle back through to the bottom. Another team will emerge up, and that's where they want it to be. Adam Silver said it directly. He's on the TNT pregame show the other day, and he said that's a big part of it, right? Is to create the parity within the league, and they believe that this will do that.
I didn't realize I was on mute. The parity sounds great, right? In kind of like a perfect world, every team having an opportunity to be challenging for a championship, to be rebuilding, but things don't work that way. For some front offices are just more intelligent, or they operate in a more efficient manner than what others do. Some front offices genuinely just value being a playoff team rather than being a championship team. And
ownership groups too.
Yeah,
they're content just to be in the playoffs every year. Yeah,
sell some tickets at the playoffs, make a bit of profit, and then that's them. So then, when you have that kind of, I don't know, apathetic approach towards being a competitive team, and now you have this kind of forced parity, right, where it's kind of a little bit out of your control. How does that start to benefit the teams that genuinely want to win? Do we see teams start trying to move off from some of their better players just because they don't want to, not that they don't want to be contending, but they just don't want to have to foot the bill of what happens once you start being that contending team? Do we start to see guys like, I'm pulling a name out of the air because I know Indiana probably do want to be competitive, but do you start seeing someone like Tyrese Halliburton become super max eligible and then start being shopped around because the team don't want to even flirt with that second tax apron?
Yeah, I mean, you could like example. I'll use the Celtics as an example. I think, like I said, I think they're gonna give Jaylen Brown the super max, but what it'll cost you is someone like Malcolm Brogdon, right? Because where it's take $22.5 million right now, today's world, all that is tax money, right? And they were willing to pay it, and quite frankly, worked out better than I think anybody ever could have expected. He won Sixth Man of the Year. He stayed healthy all the way until the very end of the year. And I have other thoughts on with I'll just give them very quickly. I think now's maybe the time to sell on Brogdon because I have very, very severe doubts he's going to stay healthy again. This is the first time he's been healthy in a season since his rookie year, and I don't. Maybe they finally found the magic mix of coming off the bench, playing less minutes. Maybe that is something to that. But he also was very clear he came off the bench, but he doesn't want to, right? He wants to start. And that's not even a bad thing. I don't have that's not a criticism. I fully get why he would rather start. He's been a starter his entire career until this season. But I think it's the combination of all those things with the money he makes. If you could break him up into a couple guys to flesh out the depth a little bit better, you're fine, right? You still have Derek White, you still have Marcus Smart. Jaylen Brown's going to play a lot of minutes in the backcourt if they go to a two big lineup more often. And if you move on from Brogdon, you can maybe keep Pritchard around because now there should be minutes open for him. But that's just a little aside there of the kind of guys I think that are going to get caught up in these roster decisions. It's not always going to be the star level guys. Teams are still going to retain their very best players. It's just going to be everybody else. And what you're going to end up with is these teams that all look a lot like what the Lakers looked like for a couple years, where it's a few high-end guys and then a bunch of guys that are making the minimum, or maybe one or two guys that you've kind of retained over the years or turned into something else via trade or whatever it is. That'll be where it'll go. What will really stand out over the next, let's say, 5 years, the teams that really scout really, really well and can find those bargain players, whether it be bringing them over from overseas, somebody who, they didn't get drafted, they went overseas, they really developed, and they became some of the Daniel Tices of the world, those kind of guys that can come in, fill a rotation role on the minimum, and we can just move forward with those kind of guys. So the Tices, the Shane Larkins, those kind of players, those are going to be the huge gets for teams, is in addition to the Austin Reeves of the world, where it's like, man, this dude can really play and everybody else missed on him. And, whether there's going to be obviously a lot of luck involved there too, but it'll be, let's go, with that. And I think because teams may have, instead of one or two end of the bench spots like that, we may be talking about 3 or 4. You're going to see teams probably cycle through guys a lot quicker. It'll be bring a guy up, have him for a couple weeks. Didn't really work out. Let's move on. Let's get another guy in and just keep that diamond mining process churning until somebody pops. And it's like, all right, now we got him. Let's move forward with this guy. And that's going to be the kind of things that are going to happen here that I think were not necessarily what the NBA was intending to do. And then you're going to see just a whole bunch of dudes pushed into the middle that are going to be, man, my team could have re-signed me for $20 million, but they made the decision to let me go. And now all that's available for me is the, 12, 13, $14 million mid-level exception. And that's going to be what I have to take instead. So their number came down a little bit, but they're onto a different team. And that's how we cycle this through. It's going to be a lot more moving and moving and moving. You're going to be constantly seeing rosters churning in a way that we don't necessarily see today. And the very best front offices are going to be the ones that act very quickly and act early versus the ones that sit around and wait.
Last question here for you, Keith. I know we got to get you out of here. For the Celtics, one thing that has become very evident, they're not going to be players in free agent this year or really for the next couple of years. So if this team is to enter into the trade market and look to shake up, whether it's the core or whether it's some of the surrounding pieces, do you have any particular player type and or a specific player that you think should be on Celtics fans' radar for this particular offseason?
You don't have any specific players just because it's not that starts to trend into like fantasy world for me where I'm not necessarily what I
we gotta try and get a soundbite out of you.
Sure.
Keith. That's part of the dig here, man. I gotta try and blow you up on that somewhere.
Player types though, they need another bigger wing, right? It turned into by the end of the year, it was Tatum and Brown, and that was it for wings with size because Hauser was completely out of the rotation for the vast majority of the playoffs. I don't know that he's going to develop enough to get back into that mix. So that's where, I'd be doing that. And then if you lose Grant Williams, you need a third big, right? You need another big that can float between the 4 and the 5 that you can rotate in there. And that's where, you just got to cover yourself because what are the chances Rob makes it through a full season? Probably pretty low, right? We haven't seen him. Al Horford's getting older, right? It's, I think this is going to turn into some of those for the most part, he only missed the back-to-backs this year. I don't know that he ever missed another game due to injury. I'm sure he probably did, and I'm forgetting. But, it might be one of those things where, hey, a sprained ankle is no longer is enough to sit out the back-to-back, and then you're back on the, fourth night. It might turn into now you're out for a week, right? Just because, where he's at in this point in his career. That's where I think, gotta get another big in there. If Grant's not going to be part of the mix, get a big wing, somebody who can do something at that spot. Fortunately, there's a whole bunch of guys like that could be available. And again, some of these guys are going to get squeezed, right? And they may not get the contracts. And maybe that big wing or big, because he doesn't necessarily play big, maybe that's Danilo Gallinari. I don't know. I tend to think of him more as a big wing because he's the size of a power forward, and probably that's what he is defensively, but he doesn't really play that way, offensively, like a big in that standpoint. And then just, fill out your depth the best way you can. It's not the worst thing in the world if this team mostly runs it back. Like, I know that Pete, there was
not
points
what fans want to hear. I agree with you, but that's just not what a lot of fans are feeling. Right?
I'm in the camp where I don't mind if you run it back, but I'd really prefer you not to.
Yeah, like I said, and this is not a knock on Malcolm Brogdon, because I think he really did give them everything they wanted him to give them, and it was just unfortunate he got hurt. I just envision, we're going to be, mid-December, and it's going to be, Malcolm Brogdon's out for 2 months with something, just because that's how it's always gone with him. Mm-hmm. This was literally his first healthy year since his rookie season. And I don't think you can bank on getting another one out of him. Not at his age and where he's heading. And the other reality is he going to shoot 45% or whatever it was from three again? That's probably not overly likely too, right? And if I'm choosing between the two, I'm picking Derek White every day of the week, and it's not even close. Just in general, I would start the process maybe of Marcus, you're going into that your old former whatever the hell he called it, stretch six role or whatever it was he called it. You're going back into the super sub role. We're going to run with Derek White, especially if we run two bigs. White, Brown, Tatum, Al, Rob. Run that, see where it goes. On the nights when Al sits or the nights we need another guard, Marcus can slide in. You play a little bit smaller or whatever. Still is going to play 25, 30 minutes a night off the bench anyway. But I would put the ball more in Derek White's hands. I think if you could get Tatum and Brown to buy into, let Derek White be the playmaker, it'd be so much the better for everybody. He was a really good on-ball playmaker with the Spurs, and he's been kind of turned into this, off the ball secondary playmaker with Boston, which he's done quite well with also, but I'd like to see the ball in his hands a little bit more and not just in the 6-man role, right? I'd like to see him kind of in that mix where it's all right, let's go forward with this. But it's the lineup versatility is a blessing and a curse, right? Because there's a lot of different ways you can go, and there's a lot of different guys you could probably, quite frankly, make pretty angry if it's, hey, guess what? You're going to be the bench guy this year and go that way, because there's a lot of guys who are, wait a minute, like I'm a starter, like I've been a starter now, and that's just something they're going to have to work through.
Keith, you are one of the hardest working guys in the biz. We always appreciate you taking time here. It's been really fun getting to know you a little bit more, working through Celtics blog. And obviously, this is not your first time here with us on Green with Envy. So we appreciate you joining us here. Anything you want to shout out for some work you got coming up with Spot Track that you want to highlight?
Man, we got just stuff every day. I think today 3 pieces went up today alone. Clippers offseason preview, Cavaliers offseason preview, and then one of my favorite pieces that I write every year, it's the rookie scale extension kind of preview predictions, where I go through all 30 guys who could have been eligible. Some are obviously not because they've been traded or waived or whatever, or had options declined. But I go through all 30 of the guys from the 2020 draft class and make a prediction on what they'll sign for. My track record on those is actually pretty good. I've been, either right on or in range on most of the guys I predict over the years. There's always one or two that just comes out of nowhere and surprises me. And this year's a little bit different because you can do 5-year non-designated player extensions for rookie scale guys, which is a whole new thing that didn't exist in prior years. So that's going to take a little bit for me to recalibrate, but that went up today, and that's always a fun piece.
All right, well, go follow Keith. Check him out at Spot Track. And then, Adam, any final thoughts you got for us here before we send this out with some Black Sheep Optimists?
Make me some draft picks that I really want. And Keith, man, it's always a pleasure, man. Thank you so much for your time.
I appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
All right, y'all. That's it for this episode of Green with Envy. We will catch y'all on YouTube. Make sure you're following us across all social medias. Appreciate y'all for listening. Peace.